Marvel Studios just released Fantastic Four First Steps, a retro-futuristic reboot that's being positioned as a clean slate for the MCU. The box office projections are steady, the reviews are cautiously optimistic, and the accompanying Variety interview with Kevin Feige has thrown gas on a growing conversation. Critics and YouTubers alike are dissecting his words, not just to glean insights about the film, but to probe something deeper. Is Feige still the right person to lead the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Many voices are saying no, that this interview all but confirms Disney needs to start looking for Feige's successor, that the creative vision behind the MCU is exhausted, and the man who once defined modern blockbuster storytelling may now be the one preventing its evolution. But that's not what we're here to unpack, because this video isn't about whether Feige should be replaced today. It's about legacy, specifically the legacy he could have had, and arguably should have had, if he had chosen to step down after Avengers Endgame. That film wasn't just a finale, it was a cultural landmark, the end of a coherent, character-driven saga spanning 11 years and 22 films. It became, at the time, the highest-grossing movie ever, unadjusted for inflation, and it gave the MCU something no other cinematic universe had ever achieved: a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what makes the timing of Fantastic Four First Steps so bittersweet. It's designed to offer new audiences a fresh entry point, set in an alternate reality, Earth 828, removed from the increasingly tangled canon of the original MCU. And while it might succeed on its own merits, the very need for a soft reboot underscores a deeper issue: that the MCU's narrative has become so unwieldy, so bloated, that people can no longer be expected to start at the beginning. Back when Iron Man hit theaters in 2008, jumping into the MCU meant stepping into a relatively small and exciting world. Now, it means committing to nearly 40 films and dozens of interconnected TV shows, each promising essential context for the next. It's the pop culture equivalent of enrolling in a graduate level course on superhero mythology. And that's not just daunting, it's alienating. What's striking about Feige's recent comments is how deeply he seems to understand the scope of the problem. In the interview, he acknowledges that between 2008 and 2019, the era of the Infinity Saga, Marvel produced roughly 50 hours of storytelling. But in just the 6 years since Endgame, that output has more than doubled. Over 100 hours of new content created at twice the speed. He doesn't sugarcoat it either, saying, quote, "That's too much," he says plainly. He even admits for the first time in the studio's history that quantity trumped quality. Most telling of all, he reflects on the burden of keeping up with the tangled web of stories. Quote, "It used to be fun, but now do I have to know everything about all of these?" End quote. It's a textbook example of the law of diminishing returns. The concept is simple. The more you keep investing in a fixed system, the less reward you get for each new unit of effort. That's precisely the trap the MCU fell into. After Endgame, Marvel began flooding audiences with content. More hours, more characters, more crossovers. But the outcome wasn't greater engagement, it was fatigue. Early phases yielded exponential excitement and cultural resonance. Now, each new release lands with diminished impact, fighting harder for smaller rewards in relevance and reaction. The magic wasn't in the quantity of content, it was in the pacing, the purpose, and the payoff. Once those elements faded, the returns inevitably declined. The shift from streamlined crossovers to dense, reference-stuffed spectacles reflects how Marvel's former strength, its interconnectedness, has become a liability. What once welcomed casual viewers now demands near-exhaustive media literacy. Dropping into the MCU used to feel like jumping into a story. Now it feels like enrolling in a curriculum. That evolution speaks volumes, not just about the studio's trajectory, but about the priorities guiding its decision-making. Still, even within the framework of diminishing returns, some outliers prove the rule isn't absolute. Spider-Man No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine are clear standouts, defying the fatigue that has plagued much of the MCU's recent slate. No Way Home owes much of its success to its focus on one of the holy trinity of superheroes. That was Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, whose cultural grip has remained unshaken. Even The Amazing Spider-Man 2, despite its critical reception, didn't lose money. And with Spider-Man Brand New Day on the horizon, history suggests it'll be another win because it's a Spider-Man movie. Likewise, Deadpool and Wolverine wasn't just Deadpool 3. It was the long-awaited return of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, capped off by the fan-thrilling debut of a comic-accurate costume. These films succeeded not by reinventing the wheel, but by tapping into legacy, nostalgia, and the kind of event status that transcends the broader decline. Contrast that with franchises like X-Men Dark Phoenix, which never stood a chance. Post-production was bogged down by the Disney-Fox merger with substantial narrative changes, including the removal of the Skrulls and a heavily reworked ending. The final product felt compromised and scattered, underperforming both critically and commercially, and the New Mutants fared even worse. Delayed so long that the cast visibly aged out of their roles, it finally released in June 2020, when pandemic shutdowns left most theaters closed. The cards were stacked against it from every angle. These films didn't fail because audiences didn't care. They failed because they never got a real shot. Poor timing, studio interference, and muddled strategy turned potential into forgettable misfires. In contrast, No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine thrived by rising above chaos, leveraging timing, nostalgia, and relevance with surgical precision. And that brings us to the heart of the matter, the confession. Because now it's not just the fans feeling overwhelmed, it's Feige himself. And this cracks open the deeper question of legacy. Feige could have bowed out at the peak, remembered forever as the architect of a cultural triumph. Instead, he kept going, just like the Energizer Bunny. And now, the very franchise he built is beginning to buckle beneath its own weight. Which leads us to a perfect parallel. David Tennant's run as the Doctor in Doctor Who. Tennant departed after Series 4, arguably at the character's peak in the modern era. Yet he did a few specials to help the transition, but he didn't linger. He left while the show was still riding high, and because of that, his legacy has remained largely untarnished. He's remembered as the Doctor for an entire generation, not because he stayed the longest, but because he left at the right time. Feige had that same opportunity. Endgame was his journey's end. It was the moment to exit gracefully, pass the torch, and allow a new creative voice to shape what came next. Instead, he kept pushing forward. And now, instead of being revered for the Infinity Saga alone, he's being critiqued for the Multiverse Saga's mess, a sprawling, desperate attempt to fold every past Marvel property into one continuity. What once felt ambitious now feels absolutely indulgent. Disney, Marvel, and Feige learned the wrong lessons from Avengers Endgame. That film wasn't just successful, it was a finale to a 22-film saga, a payoff to a decade of anticipation. Its box office dominance came from delivering on that promise, not from a replicable formula. But rather than treat Endgame as the narrative swansong it was, they saw profit over closure. The studio pressed forward, chasing diminishing returns with Secret Wars as the new North Star, despite no clear narrative engine to justify its existence. Yes, we can debate whether earlier MCU entries worked as standalone films or depended too much on connective tissue. That's a conversation worth having. But Endgame worked because the connective tissue paid off. Now the connective tissue is the product itself. That pivot from narrative fulfillment to content perpetuation didn't just shift Marvel's internal compass, it triggered a genre-wide ripple effect, inviting studios to believe cinematic universes were inherently sustainable, regardless of story logic. But building a universe without purpose is like drafting sequels to a book that already ended. To understand how precarious that strategy is, we have to look backward, because Marvel wasn't the first to chase crossovers. Universal tried something similar almost a century ago. And here's where history repeats itself in a different way. Shared cinematic universes aren't a Marvel invention. Universal did it back in the 30s and 40s with their monster movies. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. Over time, they crossed characters over into films like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman and House of Dracula. But those films weren't building toward anything. They were episodic spectacles, fun but forgettable. What made the Infinity Saga special was that it broke the mold. It told a long-form story with thematic resonance, character arcs, and emotional catharsis. It had structure. It had an ending. That's what elevates a franchise from pop culture to film history. Coherence. And Feige, more than anyone, understood that. Or at least he did. Now, post-Endgame, we're seeing the cost of not stopping. Not just in story quality, but in tonal balance. The MCU has increasingly relied on humor to deflate tension, a problem that began after the Avengers that came out in 2012 and snowballed from there. What once felt smart and snappy now undercuts drama. Thor: Love and Thunder is a case study in how tonal inconsistency can derail emotional investment. Even serious character moments are played for laughs. Sincerity is sacrificed for spectacle. So between tonal drift, content overload, and narrative incoherence, the question becomes, what is the MCU now? If it's no longer a character-driven saga, and if its continuity is no longer a reward but a burden, what's left for new audiences? Is it even worth recommending someone start with Iron Man anymore? Or are we at a point where entry into the MCU requires either skipping ahead or opting out entirely? The MCU's post-Endgame identity isn't just suffering from content overload, it's fractured by expectation. Watching a new film often means doing homework across multiple Disney Plus series, each weaving layers of essential canon that weren't required a decade ago. This wasn't always the case. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. frequently acknowledged events from the films, but the films never returned the favor. The Netflix shows Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, The Punisher, and The Defenders were technically set in the same universe, but operated in isolation, never truly accepted into the cinematic fold until Charlie Cox's Matt Murdock appeared in Spider-Man No Way Home, and Vincent D'Onofrio's Kingpin appeared in Hawkeye. Now, with Jon Bernthal confirmed to reprise his role as the Punisher in Spider-Man Brand New Day, it feels like the MCU is retroactively stitching these stories into a continuity that was never designed to hold them. Instead of coherence, we're getting correction, and that's a sign of a brand no longer leading the narrative, but chasing it. This unraveling of structure didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened under the stewardship of the man who once made structure Marvel's greatest asset. Feige had a way out. He could have left behind a legacy defined by the Infinity Saga, a cultural achievement that took cinematic storytelling to unprecedented heights. Instead, he's still here, trying to rebuild amid burnout, brand fatigue, and fractured audience interest. Marvel Studios' Fantastic Four: First Steps has launched with a wave of optimism. The film earned an 87% critic score and 92% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, marking the highest rated entry in the franchise's history. According to The Hollywood Reporter, it pulled in $24.4 million in Thursday previews alone, scoring the biggest preview gross of the year to date, ahead of DC's Superman with only $22.5 million, and only trailing Deadpool and Wolverine at $38.5 million. Among recent Marvel titles, Variety reports that the film earned $57 million on opening day, making it the second biggest single-day debut of 2025, just behind a Minecraft movie. By the end of its opening weekend, Fantastic Four: First Steps had stretched to a $118 million domestic debut, outperforming initial projections and securing the fourth largest domestic opening of the year with a $218 million global total. But here's where things get interesting. Just a few months ago, Thunderbolts debuted with similarly glowing reviews, 88% from critics, 93% from audiences. Yet despite the praise, it lost millions at the box office, earning only $382 million worldwide against a break-even point of $425 million, as reported by Variety. The film opened to a modest $76 million domestic weekend, a respectable number on paper, but one that couldn't sustain long-term momentum. It's now considered one of the lowest-grossing MCU films to date. So what gives? The contrast between these two films highlights a deeper issue. Critical acclaim no longer guarantees commercial success in the post-Endgame MCU. Since 2019, only Spider-Man No Way Home, which grossed $1.92 billion, and Deadpool and Wolverine, which grossed $1.33 billion worldwide, have truly broken through. Even Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which grossed nearly $955 million worldwide, had a reported production budget of over $400 million, meaning its profit margin was razor thin. This pattern suggests that Marvel's brand alone isn't enough anymore. Audiences are more selective, and the novelty of interconnected storytelling has worn thin. Fantastic Four: First Steps may be riding high now, but its long-term success will depend on more than just good reviews. It'll need to prove that the MCU still has fresh stories worth telling. And this isn't Marvel's first swing at the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four aren't fresh faces. They've been part of Marvel's DNA for decades. Unlike the Thunderbolts, whose cinematic debut introduced lesser-known characters to the mainstream, The four have a legacy stretching across multiple animated incarnations. The 1967 Fantastic Four cartoon gave a Saturday morning audiences a first glimpse of the team in animated form, followed by the stylized 1978 The New Fantastic Four, which famously replaced the Human Torch with a robot due to licensing concerns. But it was the 1994 Fantastic Four, the animated series, that truly carved out a fan base, airing alongside Marvel's golden age of animation with contemporaries like X-Men the Animated Series and Spider-Man the Animated Series. Though it only lasted 26 episodes, its storytelling and iconic character designs left a mark. Even the 2006 Fantastic Four World's Greatest Heroes series, despite mixed reception, kept the brand alive with the younger generation. All of this underscores the simple truth. The Fantastic Four were never niche. They're not being reintroduced, they're being recontextualized. And as their animated legacy laid the groundwork for generational fandom, Hollywood kept trying to capture that same magic in live action. The franchise has been rebooted so many times, it feels more like a studio's rite of passage than a cinematic strategy. Back in 1994, Roger Corman infamously produced a $1 million version that was never officially released, designed purely to retain the rights. Yet, despite its bootleg status, grainy VHS transfers, and zero marketing budget, it's become a kind of cult artifact. Not because it was good, but because it was honest, earnest. A film that didn't know how to be anything other than what it was. An awkward, low-budget translation of Marvel's First Family, unburdened by billion-dollar expectations. Some say it's the best Fantastic Four movie ever made, and no one's entirely joking. Then came Tim Story's glossy 2005 adaptation and its 2007 sequel, Rise of the Silver Surfer. Critically lukewarm, yes, but narratively coherent. A rare feat by today's standards. Chris Evans' performance as Johnny Storm was so charismatic it retroactively softened audience opinion, especially after he graduated to the MCU royalty as Captain America. Even Galactus as a Cloud, while meme-worthy, felt thematically on brand for a movie universe that hadn't yet mastered cosmic scale. These films didn't reinvent the genre, but they also didn't implode trying. That honor goes to Josh Trank's 2015 Reboot, aka Fant 4-Stick, as the stylized poster so desperately insisted. Another rights retainer disguised as a visionary overhaul, it stumbled through reshoots, studio interference, and a PR campaign so self-destructive, even the cast couldn't pretend to care. Kate Mara admitted she never saw the final cut, and the entire enterprise remains a monument to what happens when IP management supersedes creative direction. And yet, in the wake of Fant 4-Stick's implosion, something remarkable happened. Everyone walked away relatively unscathed, except for Josh Trank. Miles Teller bounced back with War Dogs, Bleed for This, and Top Gun Maverick, reestablishing himself as a versatile leading man. Michael B. Jordan vaulted into prestige territory, earning acclaim as Killmonger in Black Panther, and leading the Creed franchise, a continuation of Rocky that became a genre-defining success. Kate Mara starred in The Martian, Megan Levy, and Chappaquiddick. Even Jamie Bell, who played The Thing, carved out a strong post-Fant 4-Stick career with roles in Rocketman, Turn Washington Spies, and Shining Girls alongside Elizabeth Moss. But Trank? He became the cautionary tale. Despite early promise with Chronicle, the fallout from Fant 4-Stick effectively sidelined him. A rare case where a single studio misfire torpedoed a director's momentum while leaving the cast completely untouched. It's ironic, almost tragic, that the film meant to launch a new era of Marvel storytelling became a graveyard for one man's vision and the studio's misplaced optimism. And in that irony, we find a metaphor for Marvel's post-Endgame identity. A machine that can afford to lose its humanity as long as the IP survives. It's a perfect case study in how timing defines legacy, not just success. Every major cast member of Fant 4-Stick managed to recover, pivot, and thrive, but Trank, who bore the creative weight, was left behind. The one who stayed longest became the one most forgotten. There's a lesson in that, and it echoes far beyond one failed superhero film. David Tennant understood the power of a well-timed exit. So did the creators of the Infinity Saga. The tragedy here isn't just the decline. It's that Feige didn't see it coming, or worse, saw it coming and chose to ride it out anyway. Feige's continued leadership wasn't just a surprising choice, it bordered on self-sabotage. The decline of the MCU was so foreseeable post-Endgame that even a blind man could have seen it coming. He had the rare chance to exit as the undefeated architect of a cultural juggernaut and let the next guy inherit an impossible task. Because let's be honest, how do you follow the Infinity Saga? Anything less would look like failure, and in that vacuum, Feige's legacy would remain untouched. Instead, he stayed, not to protect the house he built, but to keep renovating until the foundation cracked. Remember, before the movie was called Avengers Doomsday, it was called Avengers The Kang Dynasty. Then Jonathan Majors was fired from Marvel, and Marvel couldn't simply recast him because Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania set it up that Jonathan Majors played every version of Kang in the MCU. So Avengers Doomsday and bringing back Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom just feels like a desperation move at best. And that brings us to Kang. Unlike Thanos, whose motivations, while flawed, were rooted in a belief that his actions would benefit the universe, Kang's motivations in the MCU seem disappointingly shallow. Thanos saw himself as a necessary evil, a savior willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for what he perceived as the greater good. Kang, on the other hand, appears to act out of boredom. His actions lack the gravitas and moral complexity that made Thanos a compelling antagonist. This lack of depth is compounded by the narrative setup in Loki Season 1, where it's revealed that Kang will inevitably return as the overseer of the Sacred Timeline. This revelation undermines any stakes the character might have had. If Kang's destiny is preordained and his motivations are as trivial as boredom, why should audiences care? The MCU's attempt to position him as the next Thanos falls flat because it fails to provide a villain with equally compelling stakes or philosophical weight. But even Thanos, for all his gravitas, had a flawed plan. His belief that having the universe's population would solve its resource crisis ignored a fundamental truth. Population growth is exponential, not linear. Within a few decades, the universe would have just returned to the same problem he sought to prevent. Unless Thanos intended to repeat the snap every few decades, his solution was inherently temporary. Yet what made Thanos compelling wasn't the logic of his plan, but his conviction. He saw himself as a necessary evil, a savior willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save the universe from itself. That moral complexity, however flawed, gave his character depth and made him a villain worth remembering. What truly makes a villain compelling is the belief that their actions serve a higher purpose, a conviction that mirrors the moral drive of the heroes opposing them. This philosophical symmetry creates dramatic tension rooted in ideology, not just conflict. Thanos embodied that idealism no matter how flawed, but a villain like Kang, whose motivation boils down to boredom, disrupts that dynamic. That might work in the short term. Neil Patrick Harris's Celestial Toymaker in the Doctor Who 60th Anniversary Special is a prime example of chaos done right. But for a sustained narrative, chaos for chaos' sake crumbles. Audiences crave antagonists with purpose, and when that purpose is missing, investment fades fast. Okay, I've rambled long enough, so here's where I throw it to you. Should Kevin Feige have retired after Endgame? Has the MCU's success poisoned its own accessibility and long-term relevance? And would you still recommend starting with Iron Man, or is the franchise simply too bloated? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Kevin Feige built the most successful cinematic universe in film history. That's not up for debate. But legacy isn't just about creation. It's about knowing when to let go before the story loses its shape. In staying past Endgame, Feige didn't just miss the moment, he redefined it. He stayed through box office stumbles, creative misfires, and a villain built not on ideology but on boredom. He watched the interconnectivity he once championed become a burden, saw characters recycled for nostalgia's sake, and bore witness to reboots that couldn't escape the franchise's own shadow. Fantastic Four First Steps may be promising, but it's also symptomatic. A new beginning built on the wreckage of too many misaligned endings. And with every attempt to recapture momentum, from multiverse mashups to tonal whiplash, the MCU stretches thinner. All because the man who gave it structure couldn't see when that structure had run its course. Now, instead of being remembered as the man who closed the book on the Infinity Saga, he risks becoming the guy who kept scribbling notes and margins until the story stopped making sense. So until next time, keep questioning the stories we're told, keep celebrating the ones that get it right, and remember, not every franchise needs a Phase 4 or Phase 5, let alone a Phase 6.